once again, and today I'll be doing a Yu-Gi-Oh! Tier analysis video. And we'll be starting off with T.G.s. So let's get started. For the pros, this deck has good monsters. This deck can swarm. This deck can float, and this deck is also fairly consistent. The only problems I could see are it struggles going second because it's a combo deck, and just a single negate could pretty much screw you over. This deck has little to no bite because even if your opponent doesn't have any negations, the best you could do is just summon a bunch of beefy synchro monsters and hopefully beat your opponent. Yeah, hopefully just beat down your opponent, but that's very unlikely, especially in today's game. Like at most at most you just summon like a 400 beater and just hope that your opponent can't out it. Or just summon a bunch of Tech Genius Synchro monsters and draw a bunch of cards off of Hyper Librarian, which is at 1 now. Thanks, loopers. I mean, granted, Hyper Librarian should be at 1 even without the whole Trish loop. Yeah, pretty much they don't have any powerful end board or any OTK plan. Wow, speaking. They don't have that much OTK power at their disposal despite having a 4,000 attack monster, which is pretty sad actually. And this deck, like I mentioned, could lose to a single negate because it takes a lot of cards just for you to make power plays. Like just for you to go into your link 3, you usually have to use like so many cards in your hand, and even then, for its effect to work, you must also have another TG monster in your hand. So you'll probably have to start off with 4 TG monsters or 3 TGs, 1 TG that can also function as multiple TGs. Which, to my knowledge, I don't think you can do that in a way that would actually help you summon the Link 3, since the Link 3 specifically asks for 3 monsters. And the only monster I could think of that actually counts as multiple monsters is the TG Grub. And yeah, Tank Grub. And that only spawns a token, but it has to be sent to the graveyard for that to happen. So, and I think it has to be as synchro material too. But anyways, also I forgot to mention, this deck lost Soul Charge. So there isn't really much that this deck can just do. Like if they had like their own in-theme Soul Charge, like Battle Wasps, maybe they could do something. But as it stands, this deck, I don't know, this deck just doesn't have any bite. They don't have that many power plays. And they don't really have that many ways to come back into the game and actually do something impactful. Anyways, for the stats, I'd give it a 2.5 out of 5 in power because they do have beefy boss monsters, and if your opponent isn't careful, you could do a lot of damage to them. For defense, I'd give this deck a 2.5 out of 5 because this deck they can float, and some of their spells and traps actually help you keep monsters onto the field. So that's also pretty nice. Recovery, I'd give it a 2 out of 5 because they don't have that much. Like I mentioned, they could float, but the floating is somewhat slow. Plus, yeah, it's somewhat slow. Plus, even if you do get a hand that allows you to actually make a play, there isn't too much you can just do with that. Like I mentioned, since this deck has little to no bite. What are you gonna do? Like summon Halka Fibrax and then maybe go into Hyper Librarian, or I forgot the name of that other card. Basically, it was another level 5, like the Witch card. I forgot what it was called. Also, for versatility, I'd give it a 2.5 out of 5. Like their boss monsters may not be as versatile as I'd like, but their main deck monsters, they actually have neat and decent effects, especially when it comes to Screw Serpent as well as I forgot the name. Basically, drillfish. Yeah, I think that's the name. As well as like I think a few others. They have decent effects that allow you to remove cards your opponent have or modulate levels and all. Basically, whatever you need them to do. That's pretty nice. And for consistency, I'd give this deck a 3 out of 5 because they have a fair amount of search power. Not in theme search power, but search power nonetheless. They have Tanky, or at least they had 3 Tanky. They have Fossil Dig, which might get hit in the future, who knows. So, but even then, they still have a fair amount of consistency going for them. So because of that, I'd give this deck a 3 out of 5. I would give it a 3 if this deck actually had some bite, which is which is one of the reasons why when I was making custom cards for T.G.s, that's why I gave them their own negate. So that way they'd actually have something to interact with their opponent even further, as well as like an additional synchro monster they can access, basically giving them another toolbox. But as the deck stands now, the deck is pretty lackluster, in my opinion. Next and lastly, we have Graydles. And boy, like they were kind of a flop since they came out. And the new support they've gotten, which was like I think like a single card, it was ass. It was ass. Anyways, let's get started. For the pros, they have good monsters, or at least I would consider them good, and they can float, and that's just about where the pros end. Now for the cons, they can't swarm. You would think an archetype based on a bunch of aliens, inhabiting and snatching up the bodies of different creatures and organisms. You'd think that they'd be able to swarm and spread really, really quickly, but no, they can't. This deck loses hard to spell and trap removal because even things like MST or Twin Twister, you could basically just activate it on them as they use their effect to target a monster you control, and they wouldn't be able to. Yeah, they wouldn't be able to do much about it, since you place your Graydles in your spell and trap zone whenever you're about to steal one of their monsters. You do that first and then target, so they can essentially just pop it to negate its effect. And even if they don't negate the effect, if you take control of their monster, they can just pop it and that monster is no longer in your control. Plus, that also leaves your field wide open. I mean, they do have a trap card that allows you to special summon a Graydle from your deck if they attack directly, but let's be real. It, uh, but let's be real. Your opponent most likely will be able to get past that and also DK you. This deck also loses to boss monsters with protection. Okay, I was wondering what that strange noise was. Anyways, this deck also loses to boss monsters with protection because, like, one of the main fatal flaws is this deck has to target in order to snatch monsters, which is already bad enough. It's bad enough that you have to rely on getting destroyed by battle or by specific cards, but they target to steal monsters. So if your opponent's playing, a Chadley deck like Hazy Flames or Cosmo, you aren't gonna have any luck with that. Or any cards that basically make you unaffected by card effects or protect you from targeting. It's just gonna be an uphill battle, which is why skill drain is kind of a blessing for this deck. But at the same time, it is still sad that you have to rely on skill drain to get around monsters like that, and that's just assuming that the monsters themselves have that protection effect rather than, another card effect, like a spell or a trap that protects from targeting. Also, this deck also loses to non-destruction monster removal because they could just spin it back into the deck. They can bounce it to. They can bounce your Graydles to the hand. They could just spin them to the deck. They could use effects like Armades like effects, or they could just negate your effect. Like even if they had nothing to remove your Graydles without destruction, they could still just negate them. Plus, and on top of that, Graydles are very normal summon reliant, so you wouldn't be able to get multiple Graydles out onto the field. Thus, your opponent could just breeze right past them pretty easily, especially if they have a negate on the field and then just ruin your day. Also, yeah, this deck loses to a negate or two because if you negate, like if you just send a Graydle, which you most likely will do given how slow this deck is, then your opponent can just negate that Graydle effect once you plan to use it, and then they can just run you over. And then if you try to do the same thing again next turn, they could just negate the Graydle effect again next turn. Also, so I forgot to mention that this deck then this deck likes to rack up damage a lot, especially if you try to go the route with attacking into your opponent to steal their monsters. Like, or if you attack with Gretel Slime Jr., again, you rack up damage on yourself pretty easily. Either that or I'm just stupid. But you attack, then you try to steal a monster your opponent controls. And assuming they don't have anything to stop you, they could just... I mean, you could steal it, but at the same time, you take a lot of damage. And also, and the reason why I'm mentioning this is sometimes you have to resort to doing that because if your opponent knows you're playing Graydle, they know that they'll know not to destroy your Graydle monsters, and they'll just find other ways to get around them. And I guess they typically don't have to worry about you putting your Graydles in attack mode since the Graydles have very low attack values. So there's also that you have to deal with. Anyways, for the stats, I'd give this deck a 1.5 out of 5 in power. I'm surprised I didn't. Okay, let's just pretend I'm not. Let's just pretend I'm not doing this. Anyways, I'd give this deck a 1.5 out of 5 in power because this deck's main. I would say that this deck's main weapon is the fact that it can steal monsters. That and Greydle Dragon being able to pop two. Wait, hold up. Oh yeah, I guess pop multiple cards once it hits the field, which is pretty nice. But at the same time, like I mentioned, if you're facing there's a lot of decks that could easily deal with something like Greydle Dragon, as well as basically most of your main deck Greydle monsters. Plus, Greydle Dragon also targets, so again, there's that. Recovery, I'd give this deck a 2 out of 5 because similar to Snatch Steal, you could just basically steal games by attacking into an... Like, if your opponent has a monster on the field and their life points are low, you could just attack into them and then just steal that monster and then just use that monster to game them. Or use that monster to turn the tide of the duel. As far as versatility goes, this deck isn't all that versatile. Your versatility mostly depends on what your opponent's playing as well as what monsters you steal, but chances are, if your opponent has a really valuable monster, you won't be able to steal it all that well with the Graydle monsters. And for consistency, I'd give this deck a 2 out of 5. Because you're typically going to get your Impact or a Graydle in your opening hand, or any of your traps, or any of your pot cards to basically search or get to whatever card you want in your deck. So there are those. So because of that, I would say that this deck is a tier 3.5. It isn't good, but it isn't absolute garbage. Like, this deck has a lot of potential, but Konami, for some reason, it feels like Konami just hates this deck. Like the one support they got in like a long time was like a very crappy yeah, it was a counter trap and it had to do with targeting. And no, it doesn't stop your opponent from being immune to targeting, it stops your opponent from targeting a specific Graydle monster you control. Which is bad for so many reasons because it also involves sacrificing a Graydle monster you control. And as I mentioned, they don't swarm all that well. Like the the best cards they have that swarm is Slime Junior as well as Slime. Slime basically, but then again, for Slime you have to already get rid of a Graydle monster you control and then special summon a Graydle monster off of Slime's effect. And Slime Junior does get you two Graydle monsters, or up to two Graydle monsters, which is pretty nice. Anyways, tell me what you guys think about Graydles, Gladiator Beat. Whoops, not Gladiator Beast. Tell me what you guys think about Graydles. I'm sorry, guys. I'm just retarded. The video isn't over yet because next we'll be talking about Lavals. And let's get right into this. For the pros, they have good monsters, they have great spells. Because a lot of their spells are basically really powerful playmakers. Like their Foolish Burial is pretty nice because it also helps you set up your graveyard for rekindling plays as well as calling the haunted plays. Also, it's kind of wild how this deck has 3 rekindling, um, a card that basically is an instant synchro summon as well as a monster reborn, but still kind of flops. But I'll get to that later. This deck is fairly consistent because you have the pot cards as well as your multiple Foolish Burials, which is pretty nice. This deck is versatile because they have a wide array of synchro monsters they can go into, and some of their synchro monsters actually have different effects to deal with certain situations. So there's also that. Like if you want to do burn damage, you can, even though it's sucky burn damage. I'm looking at you, Laval X Lord. And there's also one that spins monsters into the deck, one that negates targeting effects, and then there's also one that destroys a monster. I may be remembering some of those effects wrong, so don't quote me on that. Oh yeah, and I think there's one that does piercing damage as well as attacks twice. Excuse me. And this deck has decent recovery due to cards like Laval Cannon as well as Rekindling. Or as well as that one card is basically a one card one card synchro summon. Anyways, now for oh yeah, and I also forgot to mention Naked Swarm, but I guess you guys kind of should have figured that already, given the fact that I mentioned Rekindling several times. Anyways, now for the cons. This deck can lose to more than one negate. They don't automatically fold upon one negate, or at least in most situations, but it usually takes 2 negates to pretty much put this deck down. And this deck also has somewhat lackluster end boards. They don't set up negates, but they do set up big beefy monsters that look intimidating at best. So there's that. So for the stats, I'd give this deck a 2.5 out of 5 in power, a 2 out of 5 in defense, a 3 out of 5 in recovery. Matter of fact, I should make this a 3.5 out of 5 in recovery. For versatility, I give this deck a 3 out of 5 for reasons I already mentioned. And for consistency, I'd give this deck a 3.5 out of 5. Simply because there's many ways for you to get to your rekindling as well as molten field. Somehow I forgot the name of that card. I know it has molten in its name, and it's basically the Foolish Burial of the deck. And it basically allows you to get off many of your plays. But again, for some reason I forgot the name of the card. Malting Conduction, I think, maybe. I don't know. Anyways, I'd say that this deck is a tier 3 deck. Its end boards may not be anything special, but this deck can also just swarm and potentially OTK your opponent. And it can basically apply pressure on your opponent, especially if you manage to actually out resource your opponent. And if I recall, you could also go into things like Quasar, and so I guess maybe the end boards could be better. But speaking on in a pure sense, Lavals, they're not all that powerful, but at the same time, I don't think they suck. They definitely have more bite than decks like T.G.s. And I feel like they could do way more than decks like Graydles. So I'll place this deck in tier 3. Anyways, it's been me, your boy Blue Guy, and my nose is stuffy. And I'm out.